Hi, this is Portland Conversations, and I am Jason Allen, and the conversation continues about the upcoming Portland elections. Hey, we are here today with Sam Adams. He is running as candidate for City Council, position number 4, or the other words nomenclature, City Commissioner, position number 4. Sam, how are you doing? You know, Sam, you are I recognize you from somewhere. I'm not sure. Have you been in politics before?
Briefly, yeah, 8 years, and I don't know, almost 15 years before that in appointed positions. Been around.
I've been around, yeah. So what I want to talk to you first off is about effective leadership. And I know as mayor of Portland, I mean, this is what you do, right? And especially as we're looking at what the situation we are in right now, and let's face it, no national leadership going on. How is you as the candidate and now moving into the position 4? How are you going to bring that past experience to bear, and how are you going to deal with basically what the status quo is right now?
Yeah, great question, and thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. I find local politics and local government very attractive because of the lack of partisanship. And my approach is sort of radical common sense, trying to find out the best solution to a problem, the best path to seizing an opportunity, always trying to figure out, what are trends and issues that are going to be tough to change, what we can change, and sort of how to figure out the difference. And for the trends we can't change, what are the backup plans for that? So I really like that. There's no Republican pothole, there's no Democrat pothole. It's a pothole. How are we going to fix it? So I find that very, very attractive as opposed to what's going on, as you referenced, on the federal government level. So that, since I retired from the office of mayor, and at the end of 2012, I went to work for Portland City Club as the executive director for 2 years. And that's a 150-year-old community-based research organization, sort of the secret sauce of a lot of Portland innovation. Volunteers do research on a particular topic, interview people, and then come up with recommendations from sort of the grassroots up. And it was falling in financial disrepair, and I didn't want to see it disappear, so I spent 2 years turning that around. And then I was headhunted, went to Washington, D.C., was there for 4 years, and for much of that time was the director of the United States program for a global environmental think tank called World Resources Institute that focuses on market-based approaches to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the impact of climate change. So I have that experience of having been a chief of staff to a mayor for 11 years, a city commissioner for 4 years, mayor for 4 years, but then getting sort of, resupplied with, grassroots energy and outlook here in Portland. And then the time I spent in Washington, D.C., a lot of it was traveling to cities around the world and the United States. So I was able to look under the hood of, I'm a city nerd, so I was able to look under the hood of, Delhi, India, and Beijing, China, and, Rio de Janeiro, and cities I never thought I would be able to spend quality time in to see how they addressed similar problems. And so I come back to Portland with that sort of hands-on experience, but also sort of infused with a lot of sort of new way of looking at things and how to approach it. And my decision to run was basically out of concern that the issues even before the pandemic felt like they were getting, just out of reach of solutions. And not that I have all the answers, God knows I don't, or even all the questions, but I just love the city too much to just sit by and say, that's somebody else's problem. So I wanted to offer myself as a choice. I wanted to have a good contested election on the issues. Portlanders, only about 35% of Portlanders, even before the pandemic, thought that Portland was headed in the right direction. When I ended office as mayor, after the toughest recession we'd had since the Great Depression, 60% of Portlanders thought things were going in the right direction. And I was certainly one of those Portlanders who were concerned about the direction of the city. Houselessness, affordable housing, congestion. Even then, I was worried about the viability of our really great but very vulnerable small businesses and neighborhood businesses, and then concerned about cuts that the city was making to services that families rely on, cuts to the Parks Bureau, for example, and recreational programs, and that seniors rely on. So that was my reason I didn't come back with the idea of throwing my hat in the ring, but I just felt really alarmed by what I was seeing and wanted to make a contribution, if nothing else, to the civic dialogue during this campaign.
Excellent. Let's move into affordable housing, because as we move through this crisis and we're in the midst of it, and when we start to crawl out of it, I think affordable housing is going to be one of the main concerns in the city as far as keeping prices within reach, and also those who have been so affected economically that that maybe they feel it is, no matter what, out of reach. How on the city council, how are you all going to address that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot more that we can do, and that's if I'm elected to the city council for position number 4, I'd like to be appointed to the issue of affordable housing and homelessness. I think it's important that we get on top of that. And that was before the pandemic. It's like times 10 importance now, as inferred in your question, that, people are really at sort of financial risk now more than ever. And that could mean vulnerability. It does mean more vulnerability to homelessness. The first thing is we got to increase the supply of housing in the city. For every 10 newcomers to the city, there's only been enough housing built to house 7 of them. And that puts pressure on the cost of housing, both rental and home ownership. Yeah. The city doesn't have a housing strategy, and that's not the end all and be all, but it's pretty hard, to chart a path forward if you don't have a chart. And I was interested in having the city do this back in when I first got elected to the city council back in 2005, and I just couldn't get the interest of others. As mayor, I wanted to make it really clear within the city government. There's confusion. 2 agencies, 2 bureaus did housing, 2 bureaus did economic development, and so I separated and created the Bureau of Housing and created or kept the Portland Development Commission, so we could have accountability and more sort of strategic approach to affordable housing. So I think the first thing is that strategy has to account for, and these numbers are pre-pandemic, so they're obviously going to change, but the underlying basic need is still there, is to make up just a portion of our undersupply of housing and to moderate housing costs. It means that we have to build about 23,000 units of housing in the next 10 years. And in order to do that, we have to attract, depending on how you count it roughly, about $15 billion in the city from private investors, from the private sector to build that housing. And money behind building housing usually comes from cities, big companies, insurance companies, investor groups in New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles. So they look at the best place, cities around the nation, the best place to invest housing for a return. And that can lead to a lot of mistreatment of local cities. There's some great national investors and developers out there, and there's some bad ones. So I think having a strategy and helping to define for outside investors and local investors what we're looking for, and being really clear about the number of units that we need to get private funding for, and having everyone around the table in a transparent process will help. But that's a plan. And, I'm all about action. I think action without a plan is dumb, but I also think that a plan without action, especially in these times, this pandemic times, is also foolhardy. So part of that is also coming up with sort of ready to build concepts, so that, we're offering the opportunity for developers and sites where we want, let's say, multifamily housing apartments or condominiums to happen, that we sort of pre-approve concepts for that building, and that outside investors and local investors have the certainty that if they invest in Portland, it will get done in an expeditious manner. And if we do that work up front, then we can also include neighborhood and business district concerns that might come up and try to problem solve them beforehand, not after a building permit has happened. So, having my goal would be about, 5,000 units of housing through this process, be sort of pre-approved conceptually as ready to build. In terms of land, the city has land, but also if you look at what I call the mossy parking spots at the outer edges of the big parking lots of the big box stores, they're mossy because they're not being used. Obviously, as others know, parking behavior has changed, and so those parking spots are not making money for the owners of those big stores and big parking lots like they used to. So I think there's opportunities to approach them to make some money, and for us in the process to have more affordable housing in places and communities where people will accept it, if not embrace it.
Excellent. Where, as far as the city of Portland, how do we and how does the city council go forward as far as the situation with the homeless is concerned?
Well, in 2015, the city council appropriately declared an emergency around houselessness and affordable housing. And they've invested additional resources into trying to solve the problem. But beyond that, they're not really acting like it. And it's time we do. For example, you couldn't name for me who is the coordinator of services for houselessness for Portland city government, because there isn't one.
Yeah.
Where's the weekly meeting? The war room is the wrong sort of terminology, but you get a sense of where's the weekly meeting of under the Commission Form of Government, sort of the siloed work of the city. You got fire, you got AMR, you've got the police bureau, you've got parking patrol, and where is that coordination? Where is that a weekly meeting of coordination for planning ahead and addressing concerns not only for those that are houseless, but also those that are impacted by houselessness, those that are housed? That weekly meeting doesn't happen. So there is the Joint Office of Homeless Services, and that's great, shared by the city and the county, but that's like 4 or 5 people. And the city can be a much better partner with Multnomah County through the Joint Office of Homelessness Services if it itself was more coordinated. So we need to build more housing and attract more private capital to keep the cost of housing down. And we need to coordinate the resources that we do have. And I have other ideas. You can go to samadamspdx.com/housing. But that gives you a sense of a starting point of do better, at least with what we have, and provide better services to everyone being impacted by this.
Yeah. At this unique, pivotal point in time, How does Portland continue its progressive approach to climate change and to green technology and implementing of green policy?
Yeah, we've really lost momentum when, at the risk of backslapping myself, patting myself on the back, we were number one in city for sustainability, climate action when I was mayor, and I think we're that same rating now. We're in the 20s. We've really lost momentum. We really sort of taken our eye off the ball here, and the best time to make those kinds of strategic policy changes and those strategic investments are in good economies. And this has been one of the strongest economic rebounds, even too hot at times, you as referenced with, gentrification and housing costs. Yeah. But it really is an opportunity lost. So what do? We go back to looking at, for example, when I talk about coming up with pre-approved design for apartment buildings or multi-story condo buildings, that's an opportunity from the ground floor, from the inception on the idea as you build it out, to do that in a sustainable and green way. And if you build it in and you design it in and it's part of your assumption from the very beginning, you can do it in a very cost-effective way to build it. And then the cost of operating it can even be much, much less. So we need to get back to, that's one thing. The other thing is we need to look at all the city's permitting and regulations that stand in the way, well-intentioned, but times change, that stand in the way of the kind of sustainable green development and redevelopment that we want to see. We should be making it easier for people that want to put photovoltaic solar panels on their roof. We should be making it easier for people that want to do gray water harvesting on site, so that when they wash their hands, it doesn't go in the same sewer as everything else that comes out of a house. So there's a lot more we can do. And having come from years of working at one of the top-rated environmental think tanks, I got a lot of ideas. And I think it's about the way we do business from beginning to end, not sort of bolting on the idea of, we'll have this affordable aspect to this building. It's got to be part of the whole process. Yeah.
Now, I know the word infrastructure is not a very glamorous word, but as we move forward, talk a little bit about Portland at the city level, about the infrastructure and moving forward with that, as far as like public transportation and et cetera.
Yeah, great question. And it's especially for me, a pertinent question to helping to address with local action. There's so much about the pandemic and the economic devastation. Today, we've seen the worst unemployment rate since the Great Depression. The economy is basically almost at a standstill. So a lot of that are in the hands of state, but federal and other decision makers. But there are things we can do locally, and around your question about infrastructure, that's one of them. When I was mayor, we took the 5-year plans for road construction, for affordable housing construction, for water and sewer construction. We took those 5 years worth of funded projects and we fast-tracked them to get as many of them done in the first 2 years when the jobs were needed most. And with the historically record high unemployment rate that we have now, I would say we need to take as a city that same approach again, to fast-track projects. The jobs are needed now more than ever, probably not as needed in 3 years, 3, 4, and 5. We need to do that again. And while I'm on the notion of what the city government can do in a pandemic, we also need to, the budgets of the city are going to have to be cut, as are the budgets of all the other governments that work in the city of Portland. And within the 146 square miles that is our city boundaries, there are about 26 layers of government, independent governments that spend around $13-14 billion a year. It makes no sense to have the City Bureau of Transportation, sticking with transportation, down on 4th Street, making decisions in a room by itself about what'll be cut. And then you have TriMet, out in the Southeast in their conference room making decisions about what they're going to keep and cut. There are 9 transportation mobility providers doing work in the city of Portland, And if they cut the wrong things, if they cut frontline services, that will risks deepening the misery of this economic recession. Businesses count on those services, businesses that hire or not hire employees. So we need to be making cuts that are, coordinated among those stacks of government: transportation, public safety, parks, open spaces. That, the cutting the right things and not cutting the right, and protecting frontline services is important. In 2009, when I was sworn in, just months after the implosion of Wall Street, I had to cut with my colleagues on council, tens and tens of millions of dollars. But I had the Transportation Bureau, for example, sit down with the other transportation and mobility providers. ODOT runs the freeways in the city. Multnomah County is responsible for the bridges over the Willamette River. Had them sit down and talk about, how to coordinate the cuts, how to save frontline services by simple conversations, coordinating those efforts. We also cut 59% of my cuts in 2009 were administrative services and middle managers. Not that middle managers and administrative services don't provide value, they do. It's just not as valuable as getting money out the door to help businesses and people that are being impacted by this recession now.
Man, a lot of difficult as far because your experience with running through 2008 and the recovery from that, some real tough choices coming as far as budgetary. This is a brutal time, and the decisions that are made now by city government in the next 6 months will set the stage for how we recover, how fast we recover. We're a city of small businesses. 84% of Portlanders work for businesses of 10 or less employees. And there isn't another top 25 city in the United States that has that concentration of jobs and that number of small businesses. So we really get walloped in these national recessions. And that means that having city government, do the tough work of overcutting its budget so it has money to invest out in the recovery in the community is so important. And that's what I did in 2009, all 4 years, and $42 million in general fund services for, dislocated workers, for more shelter beds, for housing vouchers to keep people in their homes, for investing in neighborhood Main Street businesses, the Portland Seed Fund for startup companies. I'm really committed to, it's awful to cut the city's budget, but it's also an opportunity to look for that waste and inefficiency and take those savings to balance your budget and take those savings, like I said before, and invest it in business and individuals' recoveries and services in the community. Can you talk a little bit about how, at the city level, how we can get the younger generation involved and feel like that they have a voice to contribute?
Great question. I would, it will probably take definitely a change in state law, perhaps a change to the state constitution. But I think in local elections that the voting age should be 16. I think that, it's prohibited at the federal level. The state would have to make its own decisions. But for municipal elections, for local elections like city and county elections, I think it's really important that, 16-year-olds still in high school, that their voices are heard. I mean, we've seen the power, because we talk about they're the future, but we don't empower them to speak from the future. And look at what Greta, from Sweden did, and around the issue of climate. I mean, so profound. And the 24 kids here in Oregon and elsewhere that are suing the federal government, for basically having fossil fuel policies that are ruining their future. And that lawsuit, is still active. I think we really need to balance a bunch of special interests. And one of the special interests that is not getting fair time, and implied in your question, is the next generations. And I think, if wannabe politicians running for city council knew that 16-year-olds could vote for them, they wouldn't wait for 16-year-olds, to invite them into their civics class. They would be reaching out and wanting to get their opinions. And I think it's really disempowering to see these adults acting like they've got a handle on the future when clearly we often don't and need to be reminded. And those voices here and now that will inherit that future as part of our local political electoral process, I think would be very healthy.
I hear you as a guy that's firmly rooted in Generation X. When I'm around my kids and just around the young people, and they have that sort of real focused and very vocal and articulate and passionate about it. I tell you, it to me, it gives me hope that because I'll be honest with you. As far as the Generation Xer, I hate to be the poster boy for it, but we have not done a wonderful job at as far as green climate and looking towards the future and other budgetary things that we've saddled on them. So it gives me hope, and I'm glad that within your hands and City Council that we can help get more engaged in that and give a voice to the younger generation. Now we're gonna have to start winding things up because I get on little tangents sometimes on side issues. But I want to talk a little bit about you working with the law enforcement as far as it pertains to the upcoming general election season and what we saw last year with the protests and just on the cusp of almost violence. How does Portland at the city level, how do we deal with that as far as just trying to smooth over and keep the peace?
Well, I during my time leading the city as mayor, I definitely had to deal with the challenge and the opportunity around Occupy Wall Street in downtown. And my approach was to respect the right of assembly and free speech for sure, but to keep it peaceful. And obviously that's, I think, most everyone's desire for assemblies and marches to go that way. My time in Washington, D.C. as just a resident of Washington, D.C. was very instructive because talk about marches and protests, almost every day. So I got to really observe, since I lived near the White House, I got to observe in the mall, National Mall. I was able to observe, and I think what the city finally came to in terms of, you can protest, you can counter protest, but we're going to keep you apart for safety. I think that's the right approach. I think that having communications open to the key party leaders of the sort of key efforts, even though a lot of times there isn't a leader, but at least the city communicating its expectations for how a particular event will go is really important. I always used, as police commissioner, restraint because I believe in free speech. But I also, like in Occupy Portland, when it, despite the best efforts of the original organizers, was devolving into something that was not of the original organizers and was becoming inherently dangerous, we found a way to disassemble one of the largest Occupy camps in a relatively very peaceful way. And so I'd always lean into trying to keep the peace and balance that with commerce and the rights of the non-protesters, to have a life as well. Try to balance that with freedom of speech.
Excellent. Sam, where can people go to learn more about your candidacy and learn more about what's going on with you?
Yeah, thanks. www.samadamspdx.com. It's been great talking with you. Thank you. I hope I can come on again.
Hey, thank you too. We will talk to you soon, okay?
Cheers.
Excellent. Bye now.